Hey guys, so this week on FreshCap Friday Live, we had Daniel Reyes, the founder of Myco-Alliance and the co-founder of the Central Texas Mycological Society. We had a great conversation about mycoremediation, about myco-filters, about soil remediation, about different ways that even people at home can make serious contributions to the science of mycoremediation by doing a little experiments. It was a really fascinating conversation. Daniel's doing some great work with fungi and with mycoremediation, and he's got a lot to teach. So I really hope you enjoy this interview. Here we go, and there he is, Daniel.
Hello. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for joining us on FreshCap Friday. So this is really great. For everybody watching, I wanted to do a quick introduction for Daniel. If you don't know who he is, he's the founder of Myco-Alliance and the co-founder of the Central Texas Mycological Society. So since 2014, he's been teaching mycological principles to hundreds of students, citizen scientists, and professionals in the USA, Mexico, and Ecuador, so all around the world really, through hands-on workshops and interactive classes. Daniel's also an experienced scientist with a demonstrated history of working in the environmental sciences industry. He's skilled in mycology, hydrogeology, and environmental compliance, which is a super cool combination of skills. And I can attest to your teaching, because I actually got to see you teach at a workshop in Telluride in August in Colorado there, and it was really an amazing thing. So I want to get into mycoremediation. I want to get into talking about how people can work on mycoremediation even at home. But I thought a good place to start would be to tell us a little bit about your background and how you got into mycology in the first place.
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me here. I've been a big fan of FreshCap for a long time, and actually, Tony, when I saw you walk into the workshop in Telluride, I knew, I had a feeling that I knew who you were, but I needed to make sure. But yeah, people that have come to my classes know that I'm always sending them to your website, and especially now that you've got the YouTube videos and all those like step-by-step tutorials on the website, that's really cool. I think y'all are doing, even with these live sessions every Friday, it's just like, it's really awesome to see that mycology can be such a interesting topic that people tune in on a weekly basis and follow y'all. So yeah, thank you for coming to that workshop, and thank both of you for having me on here and doing all this work.
No, that's great. We're super happy to have you here.
Yeah, and like you said, it is an interesting combination of experiences and to some degree expertise, but really my main focus is trying to understand natural processes. I went to school for geology, then I found a love for hydrogeology, which is a combination of the hydrologic cycle, so dealing with water, with geological processes. And so that really paints a big picture for what happens on the planet, right? I mean, we are living on a planet that's just like floating in space, and it's affected by so many different things, and it is important to understand the full picture. And so in college, I was looking at the big picture, large-scale geological processes, large-scale hydrological processes. And it wasn't until I found mycology that I started looking into the details and tuning into the small-scale world of the planet. And so just to kind of go through it real briefly, like, I worked as a hydrogeologist in the oil and gas industry, and it was really interesting to be in that industry because from an environmental side of things, it's really exciting. There's a lot of really interesting science that goes on, but there's also a lot of limiting factors, right? Every site that we would work on in terms of oil spills and things like that would be different. It would require a different strategy, it would require a different approach. It would be happening at different times of the year in different places around the country. So there's never really one solution to fix them all. But what I did find was that we were doing the bare minimum, right? So the most classic example of what happens in remediation, large-scale remediation or conventional remediation, is removing the contamination from one place and putting it somewhere else and then calling it a day, right? That's kind of like our go-to because we're on a time crunch. There's a huge financial, there's a lot of financial pressure to get that site working or that pipeline pumping gas again. And so after a while, it became this idea that we could do better, right? And right around that time, I found Paul Stamets, or heard about Paul Stamets, watched his video, read his book, and it was just mind-blowing to think about mushrooms doing such an incredible work for us, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I spent about 6 months just watching videos, reading tutorials, talking to people like Jay Schindler at Fungi for the People, got in touch with Track Cotter, got in touch with a few other people that just kind of paved the road for me. And honestly, I set up a small scale lab in my walk-in closet. I think this is something that a lot of people go through. It's just like setting up a little lab in your closet and seeing what happens. You know, I was fortunate enough to have the resources.
Okay, now we're back. Technical difficulties. So sorry about that. But you were talking about building a small-scale laboratory in your closet, and that's kind of where we lost the connection there.
Cool. Yeah, I'll pick it up from there. Yeah, just to make the long story short, it took about 6 months for me to just get comfortable with sterile techniques, right? Pouring dishes. Everybody knows about this.
Yeah.
You all have a great video on how to do this, how to clone wild mushrooms, how to transfer mycelium from plate to plate, and that's really where it all started. The cool thing about mycelium, as you know, the viewers are aware of, is that mycelium reacts to whatever food source or whatever you put in here, really. And so one of the earliest tests that I did, just to kind of get familiar with the possibilities, was to drop or to pour a few drops of motor oil or diesel and just see what the mycelium would do. And over time, I just became more and more comfortable doing this kind of work and observing what would happen. And it's really fascinating that within 2 to 3 days, you can see mycelium reacting to that new source of food and do something pretty fantastic. So I spent about 6 months doing that kind of work, and after a while, like, I just decided that it was really interesting and it was worth pursuing. So I left that position with an environmental consulting company and flew down to Ecuador, where I really dove deep into the field of mycoremediation, and that's really where the story got started.
Awesome.
That's very cool, and I love how you brought up the fact of mycelium doing things like, you know, living off a food source that is motor oil. And you know, I first learned that when I was at your presentation there in Telluride, and Track Cotter was talking about this as well. But basically, training the mycelium to use things like diesel fuel or motor oil as a food source, which is fascinating, and that kind of leads into, you know, the two different areas of mycoremediation, I guess, or mycoremediation in general. So there's mycofiltration and there's kind of soil remediation as two big main topics. So I was wondering if you could give the viewers just a very broad outline of what those two things are, and then, you know, some of the cool projects that might be going on here or around the world that's pushing this science forward.
For sure, and that's a question that I get asked all the time, because it seems like we want mycelium, or we want fungi to be able to do everything, and that's not always the case. Basically, when it comes down to mycoremediation, like I said, there's two sides of it, right? Soil remediation, so like physical remediation of a toxic pollutant, versus water filtration and the removal or degradation of pollutants found in water. And they're both based on totally different properties of mycelium itself. On the one hand, when it comes to soil remediation and degrading toxic pollution, we're relying on the natural abilities of fungi, specifically white rot fungi, that have this natural ability to break down things like lignin. And they do so by secreting extracellular enzymes. So they are actively sweating out these compounds, or this cocktail of compounds, into their environment to break things down externally. And so that's that approach. And there's so many different layers to it, but that's that approach. They just sweat out this natural solution that will break down toxic pollutants. When it comes to water filtration, however, what we're relying on is the interconnected web that mycelium forms, right? And so when we look at a block, this is pretty traditional, right? We've got spawn in here, and this is pretty overgrown. This is from December, and so it's really hard as a brick. And so mycelium will get to this stage, especially when it's ready to fruit, it'll form this solid mass and actually will create this lamination around it. So this physical property of mycelium, interconnecting itself and creating this mass allows us to treat it as a filter. Now, the challenging part about mycofiltration is that water has to flow through it, right? When we want to filter water, water has to flow through the filter. And so when we let mycelium get to this stage where it's really hard and maybe it's fruiting, it's no longer allowing water to flow through it. So there's this like happy place where water can still flow through the mycelium, but tight enough that water will get, or those pollutants will get filtered through the mycelium, right? And so that's the challenging part, right? We're working with a living, active organism that has a whole life cycle, that has a whole way to react to its environment. And there's been many trials with mycelium in general. Peter McCoy from Radical Mycology talks a lot about using mycelium that has been dried out. So like spent spawn blocks, right? Because they're no longer growing, they're no longer weaving this web of interconnectedness. And so if we grow the mycelium to a point where the porosity and the permeability, these are really important things for water filtration, where they're ideal for water to flow through it, then we can dehydrate it and then use that as a filter material. Because the mycelium itself has all these binding sites where chemicals and pollutants in general can get tightly bound to it, and we can just remove it like that. Yeah, so I can go on about that all day, but that's kind of the broad picture. It's either extracellular enzymes or the physical nature of mycelium as it's growing on a substrate.
Right. And yeah, I can see the challenges there because, I mean, the mycelium and the mushrooms, they just want to do their own thing, right? And we're trying to force them to do something very specific, like maybe mycofiltration, for example. And without going too much into the weeds, so you're just saying for mycofiltration, it's more the physical structure of the mycelium that's doing the filtering than the mycelium itself absorbing some of the contaminants?
In some cases, and we have to look at the range of contaminants, right? So if we talk about bacterial contamination like E. coli, there is this natural ability for some fungi, some mycelium to be able to consume that or break it down. So it's not just the physical trap of the pollutant, but also breaking it down later on. But like I said, there's still a lot of testing that needs to be done in terms of like figuring out exactly what the mechanisms are. For my own research, I'm mostly focused on the physical properties. How do we combine different substrates, right? Sawdust, wood chips, and anything in between with the right kind of species to allow water to flow through it to mimic and replicate real world conditions. Because the last thing we want to do is to install a microfilter out in the wild and then have a big storm event and have it just wash out, or the mycelium grows while it's sitting out there and then water just flows through it, or I mean, not through it, but around it, on the side of it, completely avoiding the purpose or completely neglecting the purpose of why we install that filter. And so I think first step for me has been the physical nature of mycelium and trying to understand that. And then from there on, we can look at the range of contaminants. But yeah, for the most part, for me, it's the physical nature of mycelium. Again, with bacterial contamination, there is an actual degradation that occurs.
It is really amazing the stuff that mycelium can do. I know there's a National Geographic video with Trad Cotter that you've shared before that shows some of the metabolites that the mycelium produces when it runs into some of these contaminants, not just, inorganic stuff like motor oil, but also organic stuff like viruses and bacteria. So that's fascinating. And I know a lot of people have read Mycelium Running, right? Paul Stamets' book, which kind of kicked a lot of this off. And a lot of people have watched, well, millions of people have watched his TED Talk, 6 Ways Mushroom Can Save the World. So there's a lot of these huge ideas out there that, mushrooms can solve all these large ecological problems, which may or may not be true. But I wanted you to talk a little bit about the importance of starting small, because we can't just go out there with these big sweeping, experiments and change the world with mushrooms right away. We need to start small and truly understand this because it is such a new science. And, not only is it important to start small for those reasons, but also, since it is such a new science, people like Myco Alliance and people like me and you can make actual contributions to the science with small scale experiments. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that aspect of microremediation.
Of course. And, you know, Paul Stamets really set the stage for everybody to follow. And I think it was important to kind of come out with this grand picture of what mushrooms can do. And yeah, it is a very hyped up subject, right? Mushrooms can save the world, but it is important to get into people's faces and get them to see mushrooms. But then on the practical side of things, we do have to start small, like you said. One thing that I want to kind of clarify for people is that when oil spills happen, we can't just walk up to them. And even if we are able to walk up to them, it's not recommended because there's a lot of things in the air that we're breathing in. And so we need to have the right clothing, the right face mask, things like that. And so it's very difficult for an average person, a citizen scientist, or even a professional to just walk up to an oil spill and start doing experiments. And for that reason, I encourage people to just get familiar with mycelium. You know, like I said before, there's a lot of different conditions. There's a lot of different variables when growing mycelium, even just growing mycelium in the lab or even fruiting mushrooms in a greenhouse. There's so many things that go into doing that for us to consider, you know, putting mycelium blocks in an oil spill and be able to successfully clean that up. It's very challenging, and it's a big jump from 0 to 100. So one of the things that I would recommend is just, you know, play with mycelium, try it out on different substrates, different environmental conditions, see how long it lasts. You know, mycelium has this natural ability to break down its food source, and eventually it'll degrade or it'll die out. And so what is the rate of degradation? What is the rate of survival? What are the conditions in which it thrives? Things like that, you know, that you may not be thinking that that's remediation because you're not breaking anything that's toxic, but that in itself is teaching you what it's going to do in the natural, in a scenario like it's like an oil spill or something like that. And just some practical experiments that you can do is, at least for my example, you know, getting the petri dishes. So getting a petri dish, removing all other sources of food, right? So just pouring agar without any dextrose, without any malt extract, and then putting in a small amount of contaminants. So putting in a 1% solution of motor oil or diesel or anything that you're after and seeing what happens, and then scaling up from there. So going up from a petri dish to a bag to a plastic container, and then eventually putting it in the ground and seeing all the differences and the rates of success that comes into that. And then from maybe more like a social, you know, experiment that can gain a lot of attraction, that can be successful, would be something like cigarette butts. You know, once again, I bring up Peter McCoy because he's been one of these people that pushes for that strategy to collect cigarette butts, train fungi to break down cigarette butts, and then be able to break it down. So that's something super practical that we can do. And cigarettes are everywhere in the world. They're kind of, you know, universal sources of contamination. So we can start there. The other recommendation is going to your local bike shop or car shop, right? They're using rags to clean parts, and they usually end up with a lot of motor oil or grease, things like that, and they just toss them. They're just dumping it into the landfill. And so they'd be more than happy to just give you a bag of dirty rags. And from there, you can start testing things out. And I've done that pretty successfully, and it's really cool. You take pictures, and people get excited about that because it's practical, it's realistic, and it's not so big like an oil spill that you can do and demonstrate the success of fungi.
Yeah, no, it's definitely more accessible, and I think the more we have educators like you teaching people how to actually do these things, I think a lot of people find them really fun, right? To do small projects like, you know, a 5-gallon bucket with the oil rags and the mycelium, or the other one that you did was the 3-tier chamber for filtering water and testing out different species of mushrooms for mycofiltration, and even stuff like, you know, the burrito, the cardboard burrito for propagating mushrooms. So that's really fantastic, and that's some of the work you're doing. So you started Myco Alliance, but now you started also the Central Texas Mycological Society. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about what that is and where people can learn more about that.
Sure, and thanks for bringing that up. Yeah, Myco Alliance began as a result of that experience in Ecuador back in 2014, and so it's been a long process of just figuring out what this whole field is about, right? It's been non-traditional, it's been unconventional, outside of academia, outside of industry. I've relied a lot on people like you guys, just to teach me and to explore the different aspects of mycology. And again, I've been fortunate enough to link up with people like Trad Cotter, Peter McCoy, and then younger people like William, right, from Mycosymbiotics, who are just fascinating. They have this natural passion for the field. And so Myco Alliance has evolved over the course of 5 years. And I would say that last year, especially, I decided that it would be best to expand the vision into something a little bit more formal and service-oriented and community-based. So that's kind of where the Mycological Society came from. Also, because it's Texas, we're like the size of 3 other states, right? And it's really hard to cover the whole state with one organization. And right now, Texas only belongs to the Gulf States Mycological Society, and there's very limited representation. They pretty much focus on East Texas, but we're in Central Texas here. Here I'm in Austin, in Central Texas, and then there's a whole rest of the state west. And so the idea there was just to pass on the mission to a larger organization that can be dedicated to spreading the word about fungi, getting resources like grants and donations to keep doing this work. And Myco Alliance will pretty much continue to exist as a social media platform, and it'll just be me talking about the different projects and different pursuits that I come across, because by no means am I done with this stuff. But I thought it was really important to establish a nonprofit organization that would dedicate itself solely to research and education and outreach on fungi. And I would like to say that one of the biggest influences for starting the organization and the work that we're setting up is the Fungi Foundation down in Chile. And if some of you that are watching don't know about Fungi Foundation, look them up. They're on Instagram, they're on Facebook, they have a website, but they are the premier example of how to do this work at a large scale in the nonprofit realm and trying to elevate fungi to the likes of plants and animals. And I highly suggest you all look into the Fungi Foundation and reach out to Juliana and just learn about them, because it's super inspiring, the work that they're doing.
That's great. And to be honest, I did not know much about the Fungi Foundation in Chile at all, so I'm really, really happy you brought that up, and I'm definitely going to do a little bit more digging. And I really appreciate you bringing up, with the Central Texas Mycological Society, the importance of that and the importance of community in learning this stuff. We just started spending a lot more time with the Alberta Mycological Society recently, and Alberta, I kind of think of it as like the Texas of Canada in a way. But it is a little difficult sometimes, because it is a huge province to have one mycological society covering the whole thing. And, sometimes they'll do lectures or talks or forays, 3.5, 4 hours away. So the fact that you're doing something a lot more local is brilliant. Mm-hmm. So that's fantastic. I'll just read from your website there. It says, fungi are the foundational species for nearly all terrestrial life on Earth. They are critical links between the health, stability, and abundance of the soil, plants, and fresh water on which humans and animal life depends. It is the intention of the Central Texas Mycological Society to bring forth the recognition of mycology and the fungal kingdom as a beneficial ally in the effort to restore and sustain the resilience of the natural world, which I think is a beautiful way to sum up everything that you guys are doing. I don't want to take up too much more of your time, so I wanted to wrap this up. But one thing I wanted to ask you, if people can take kind of one thing away from this, or go and start learning about one thing about mycology or microremediation, what would you want that to be?
That's a really good question, and I would say mycelium. Watch it grow, learn about it, feel comfortable with mycelium, right? I didn't fruit mushrooms for about a year after I started learning, so really get to know mycelium, because wherever it is that you want to go with mycology, whether it's mushroom cultivation, research or anything else, mycelium is really where it's at. And so test out different substrate combinations, look for different food sources, and just watch how mycelium reacts, because in itself is, watching mycelium and observing mycelium and getting to know mycelium is where you're going to get most of these answers. Like Trad Cotter always talks about, he sets up these little gladiator matches on petri dishes where he puts 2 different species of mushrooms and then just have them go at it, and then he noticed all these little droplets. So you wouldn't know that unless you actually watched it, right? Or maybe if you talk to Trad, but it's better to just do it yourself. And I've learned a lot like that, just testing things out and watching mycelium do its thing. The other thing that I would say, just to kind of as a bonus thing, is reach out to people that are already doing this work, right? And I'm not just talking about mycoremediation, but talk to your local mushroom farmer, because unless you have the ability to produce large scale amounts of mycelium, you're gonna spend a lot of time growing that, and you could get wrapped up into the whole rabbit hole of mycelium running, or mycelium production. And a lot of the times these mushroom farms have an excess or an abundance of spent blocks, and that's the easiest way to get mycelium. I pick up about 200 to 300 blocks, spent blocks from a local mushroom farm. They're called Hi-Fi Mycology. And that has been a lifesaver, and that has been a invaluable resource, because I can take those blocks, put them in the greenhouse, fruit them again to get a second flush, a third flush. Those mushrooms become a resource for me. I can give them to volunteers. I can go to the local shops around me and exchange them for goods and services. But at the end of the day, having those blocks, I can do so many things. I can break them up, put them into buckets and fruit. I can break them up, put them into big tubs, and break down those dirty rags. I can break them up. And so there's just so many things that you can do when you have mycelium available to you. So small scale and large scale, get to know mycelium, play around with it, and have the goal to just be getting to know fungi, learn how to observe fungi. I say this a lot, but it's like, turn your fungal vision on, right? You start seeing mycelium everywhere, you start seeing fungi everywhere. It's all interconnected. And if you focus on that, mushrooms become this bonus, become this like extra gift that you get out of that work. And at least that's been my approach. I've never wanted to be a mushroom farmer, but I love growing mushrooms. So it's just this bonus that I get at the end of the work that I do.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think that's really, really good advice too. Like almost putting like your own myco-filter over your eyes, and you'll start to see the world in a whole different way. So, man, thank you so much, Daniel, for coming on this show. I think the work that you're doing is fantastic. I hope you keep on keeping on, and yeah, it was great to have you on.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And
are you heading to Telluride this summer?
I hope so. I'm actually gonna be going to Europe next month. So one thing I didn't answer, Tony, just real quick, is that two projects two places outside of the U.S. that are doing really cool work in mycoremediation is UPC or not UPC, UAB in Barcelona, the Autonomous University of Barcelona. Look them up. If you have a way to find published literature, the University of Barcelona has a lot of really awesome projects looking at mycoremediation. And then Alta University in Finland has published really awesome work in mycoremediation. And so, Spain, Finland, and Asia. I haven't really gone through the literature because not a lot of those papers are translated to English, but there's a lot of publications, even from 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and a lot of those lessons have helped me develop new research projects, new experiments. Because, like I said before, look for people that are already doing it and pick up where they left off. You don't have to start from zero.
Yeah.
Yeah, the other thing, there's a lot of really great work going all over the world. So it's as much as we want to focus locally sometimes, a lot of the stuff is getting done everywhere. So it's important to look far and wide as well. So that's really cool. If anybody missed any of that, I will put the links to anything that we talked about. I'm going to repurpose this video on YouTube, so all the links will be down below, or they'll be in the show notes in the podcast as well. So if you guys want to reach Daniel, it is the website for it is centraltexasmycology.org or at Myco-Alliance on Instagram. What's your Instagram handle for the CTMS?
It's at Central Texas, but just TX. So Central TX Mycological Society. And if you go to at Myco-Alliance, there's probably a link or two on there as well.
Awesome.
Okay, great. Well, again, Daniel, thank you so much for coming on. I think all the work you're doing is great, and all the best in your work going forward.
Yeah, safe travels to Europe, and maybe we'll see you in Telluride.
Yeah, you never know. Maybe we'll hook up in Telluride. That'd be cool.
Thank you, guys.
Okay,
Awesome.
take care, Daniel.
Have a good one. Happy Friday.
See ya.